So we have a couple of people slowly coming in. Hi guys, thank you for joining in. We'll start in just another minute or two. Are you able to access? Can you see?
So we can see their names, but we can't see them, right?
No, you can't see them.
We can see them.
Sorry for you
No,
guys.
no.
You can't see each other's faces. But for me, it becomes a bit chaotic to manage everyone's video and audio settings in that case. So, sorry, just one sec. Yes. Thank you for joining in. We're slowly getting people in. I'll.
Shivani is there.
Yeah.
Familiar faces.
Yeah, Abhi, Shivani.
Yeah.
They can all hear us, no? We're saying.
They can hear us.
Yeah, they can hear you. And I mean, if you guys would like, at some point, we can also, if we'll open out to the question answer round. Shivani, if you have any questions at that point of time, I can activate your audio or video, is what I know. But yes, so thank you for joining in. Maybe we can start and have people kind of roll in slowly. For those of you kind of logging in now, and I don't know how many of you have attended any of our talks before, welcome to the Guftgu series. Guftgu, literally taken from an Urdu word to mean casual conversations, is what we intend to do today evening with Sarsija and Nihal, who are the duo behind Reliable Copy. Hi guys, thank you for joining us today. And they're, I think, joining us from the Reliable headquarters. Can I say that? Are they headquarters, official headquarters? And I mean, they've been doing some amazing work even during this pandemic. They have somehow managed to print and release a book, which I was very, very doubtful about right in the beginning when Nehal mentioned, and he was like, yeah, I'm going to go to the printing press right now. And I was like, we're in a national lockdown. How is this happening? But I think that kind of shows the drive behind making something happen to a certain degree. So, and we're super happy to have you guys over to share not just thoughts behind Reliable, but also your own individual practices, your own process in creative expression, and also to really know what one what one can anticipate as far as publishing is concerned, especially since obviously the last few months of the pandemic have thrown all of us into a frenzy to imagine alternatives to every single aspect of our life today. And I'm sure books, which is really dependent on the tangible experience, are also going through those questions. Like the world of the printed space is also really working between, are we printed, do we go virtual, does the print even need to be virtual or not? Maybe to just start things off, maybe you can talk a little bit about how Reliable came into being and how it is so reliable. Let's just say.
I mean, I guess before we start with something like that, I'll just add to your anecdote about how we produced still life during the lockdown. And how it kind of worked out is that our printer in Bangalore, they also print for hospitals and restaurants. So they were in charge of printing for packaging material for restaurants and bill books for hospitals and registers and things like that. So then that gave them a pass to operate the factory. And we somehow got onto that and were able to produce the book. So, I mean, that's quite an interesting anecdote to describe how Reliable Copy works, because we're always slipping through these cracks and maneuvering at each stage how to actually achieve something or get something done.
Right. And I mean, it's curious, I'm curious to know that you actually mentioned this is the printing unit that you use actually also does a lot of work for hospitals, restaurants. And I think that's been something that I have personally found very intriguing for a lot of independent practitioners, at least in India, who I have interacted with over the last few months. Because there is always such sacredness, I think, given to the idea of printing something. So it always has to be extremely like clinically sanitized spaces with the tiniest details given to the slightest hues in each and every page. But and I'm sure that, not to say that these guys cannot maybe execute that, but there is a certain degree of experimentation and pushing of those ideas that you're also trying within the act of creating reliable, if I'm if I can take the liberty to say that, actually.
I mean, I guess this is a good time to introduce reliable
Reliable
copy.
copy, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, which was your original question.
Yeah.
I mean, how it started is we wanted to publish books, but more than books, we wanted to publish artworks. We were really interested in how an artwork can take the form of a publication, and the publication being not just a book, but any kind of document that can be produced in large editions and circulated in channels that are otherwise kind of inaccessible to art. I mean, it's like to think of not making a catalog. We talked about this last time, Anshika.
Yes. I was thinking about that, Nihal.
Not to reproduce artworks as a publication, but for the publication to be the artwork.
Right, right.
And a book would be one form, but a website could be another, a t-shirt could be another, a flag could be another.
Right.
So,
But for you, has it been more focused on book alone, like variations within it, but the book in itself, or?
I mean, we've only done 3 projects so far. So the first one wasn't a book. The first one, which is Chinar's A Memorial for the New Economy, we published these handkerchiefs as downloadable JPEG files on our website. So here it wasn't a book. I mean, it's a photo book in our head, but what you can download and what you get as the publication is a folder with 121 JPEG files. It's not even in a PDF. It's in no way a book in that sense.
Right.
But for us, it's a photo book.
Right.
But we found that a lot of people misunderstood it in a sense because we said we were a publishing house and we put up these pictures online and it kind of got lost. So then we did 2 books just to establish that we do publish books and a publisher. And now slowly we are looking at moving to other projects as well.
Right.
Like one of the next ones that's coming is a website project, which
Mhm.
would bring together the curriculums that have resulted from a series of workshops we're doing in Baroda with other artists, along with Gallery Arc.
Hmm.
So we're interested in more than just books in that sense. We're interested in publishing as a broader act.
Right, right. Sarsija, do you want to share any?
To add to that, I think it also allows us to access a different aspect of the artist's practice because many of the artists we work, I mean, the 3 artists we've worked with right now and whoever else we're working with in the next year or so have not really looked at publishing as a format for their work. So it also accesses a completely different aspect of what they consider practice in a sense.
Right.
So for Ravi, for example, it was about his research because as an artist, he does paper making and a lot of paper-based works, a lot of prints, a lot of paintings like large acrylic and oil paintings. But this book became more about his research that he uses as a reference for a lot of his works because he has a lot of research into vernacular culture.
Right.
That became a very show this like a heavily illustrated sort of a book,
Right.
but it was about his research. Similar with Mario as well, actually, because he's not the kind of person who writes or that's not his practice. His practice is very gallery based or installation based, but in this case, it took on a different form. So it allows us to access the artist's process in a very different manner. So I think that also became important for us.
I mean, that's actually quite interesting to look at because invariably when you think about the book and different versions of the book, I think the last time Nihal and I were in conversation, we were discussing what actually becomes considered as a book, and I tended to draw a separation between the catalog and the book, and so we were kind of looking at these different dynamics. But I think even when one begins to discuss the book form consciously or subconsciously, I think we begin to create subcategories in our own minds, you know, like, okay, this is the artist work, this is a catalog, this is a manifesto, uh, you know, but sometimes it can be kind of all of that and yet none of them as well, which is what, I mean, that's the sense I get, at least with, you know, how you look at books in that sense. And so uh, it can be that the book is the artist's work itself, but the book is its own work, you know, where resource and research and context and creation kind of come together as well to create, to make something that's separate from the artwork in some way. I don't know, there's so many labels, and I think as I'm asking this question, I'm like saying these words and I'm like, no, that doesn't really work here. And I think in many ways it's interesting to kind of have these exercises that can then actually break down these words for us, and maybe not have us rely too much on them, you know, in the act of publishing or book making even. Uh, so Nihal, I think you wanted to say something.
What I was saying is, last time we talked, I mean, I guess this is interesting to share because you also don't know about this, but Anshika drew a very fine line and said, catalogs are not art books.
Yeah. I was like, catalogs can't be art books, man. They're not artist books, you know. And it was interesting to actually have Nihal's perspective on it as well.
This earlier, where the books we make are very distinct from catalogs and approaches it in a different way. But
Right.
an example could be our upcoming book, the Shanti Road Cookbook, which in a sense is a catalog, but not of artworks, but of an art space that's been active in the city for over 17 years. But it becomes a catalog by making accessible the recipes from the kitchen of One Shanti Road. It's got over 50 contributors, or 60.
Yeah, 50. Yeah.
And each one's given at least one or two recipes. Some have given over 10, and it kind of brings it all together to show the culinary history of Shanti Road as a kind of informal art space. But at the same time, it also documents certain relationships that were manifest in the space, the people that have been a part of it. It brings in images of, I mean, it brings in illustrations of objects from the house, from the distinct parts of the house in different rooms. And it also kind of concludes with a more standard cataloging of photographs from its archive.
Right, right.
So in a sense, the book isn't an art book. It isn't an artist's book because it's an edited compilation, but it's also a catalog. But it's also an interesting book, regardless.
Right, right. And I mean, I think that's, I mean, for me, that's why maybe in my version or my perspective of the various terminologies that exist in the publishing world, sadly, you know, like for me, I think that like what begins to separate the catalog from the book form is not necessarily the content that goes in it, but I think is the intention that goes in it, you know. And that's how I begin to, that's why I was like, there's some books which are just catalogs and are not, you know. And I think for me that's what begins to draw the distinction very often. I do want to kind of at this point maybe bring in your own individual practices as well, because you know, I'm gauging most of those who've joined us might know this, but for those who don't, both Nehal and Sarsaja also have their own very independent practices in the arts, and within Reliable, you know, they I think take care of all the different departments and heads. They're like multifaceted and you know, layered, single individual run entity kind of things. But Sarsaja, I mean, even I know that you end up, I mean, you edit a big chunk of, you have edited the 3 publications that have come within Reliable. But I mean, I'm curious to know how there's been a harmony, or if there's been an impact of your own practice into Reliable and the other way around. You know,
So
I'll let you
this
kind
is
of.
interesting because I really recently did a short presentation for a few people about my practice. And as that conversation progressed, we all decided that my practice itself is editorial.
Right.
I don't really generate images or content, but it's more about bringing images and content together and putting it together in a certain manner and looking at it rather editorially. I work majorly with image and text and drawings. majorly drawing in all senses.
Right.
But I guess, I don't know, I think the closest that I would bring the relationship between reliable copy and my own practice would be reproduction as a process. I think that becomes very, very close in at least my recent works over the past 3-4 years, and what reliable copy is looking at in a certain manner, I guess.
Right.
But I don't know. I think they're both pretty much our practice and our profession. Like reliable copy is also, in that sense, an extension of practice. So I don't think I can make a demarcation between what has influenced the other. But I
Right.
think just a tendency. Like the tendency within our practices to look at certain things in a certain way seeps into the way we look at the books and the publications and the artists and everything along with that, I guess.
Right. Right. Uh, Nihal, first I'll let you answer, and then I'll bring in my little questions to this.
Salsaja and I have talked much about this.
No.
So it's like now I'm hearing all this for the first time. When you say editorial, it's very interesting because last time Anshika asked me, so she's hearing this answer for the second time. But I said that for me, it was more about working with found documents and just responding to documents, whether they're from a TV show or a film or vernacular culture, has been my practice, has been what is essential to me as an artist. So reliable copy also has been primarily an engagement with documents.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, yeah, I mean, there's no distinction, like Sarsa just said. In my art practice, I'm making one kind of document. Reliable copy, we're making another kind of document.
Right, right. And there is one thing I did want to ask when with Sarsaja, specifically, is that when you said that it's got a lot to do with different kinds of editing processes, let's just say in some ways, and these could go across mediums and across formats. I'm curious to know if the approach to editing changes with that, because when you're creating your own work, there are certain liberties that I think one can take, because the content that you're editing has also been to a certain extent either assimilated or made by you. So there are certain liberties that you do begin to take, and of course, when you're dealing with work made by whether it's Mario or Ravi Kumar, there is an engagement of a different thought process also that comes in. And I'm curious to know, like, do you realize that there are moments where there might be some works or some projects where you immediately understand the intention of like what the work also intends to do, and there might be some where it's kind of a different journey that has to be undertaken to kind of arrive at that point. And the editing process is extremely central, obviously, towards the creation of a book, because it then defines the nature of engagement from a reader's point of view as well. And so how do you navigate when you're actually editing someone else's work? With your own work, there's obviously there's more flexibility because of the pure dynamics of you being the person who's made it as well. But I'm curious to know how it works when the author is, in that sense, I guess, a different person.
This is an interesting question because I think we talk about this all the time.
Right.
Every project, it's about if we're intervening enough or if we're intervening too much, and if we're kind of, but I guess at least what I've realized over the past few books, and I'm also editing another book outside of reliable copy, but I guess it's about allowing the voice of the artist to remain, especially in a textual book.
Right.
Images, I guess, are easier to handle within a publication in a book format because that editorially can be handled in a different manner. But when it comes to text, I think the voice of the artist or the voice of the author really matters.
Okay.
And sometimes it's really hard to draw that line between what was already written and what you're kind of shaping it into.
Right.
But I think that helps because even between me and Nihal, we have very different practices in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is very, very process-based. So you're right, sometimes I don't know what the end result is going to be at all. The editorial is a part of But for him, he knows the intent right at word go. When he thinks of the project itself, he knows.
Right.
So depending on the kind of author or the artist we're working with, our practices become very important in navigating that conversation.
Right.
But I think it's about the voice of that person, trying to retain that as much as possible. Even if the editorial work is very heavy,
Mm-hmm.
realizing that they sound a certain manner or they are trying to put it in a certain manner needs to be retained, you know?
Right. Right. I mean, I think that it's something that we also, as a practicing photographer, I and not as offset at maybe this point of time, but also maybe as offset. Um, it's something that we have also kind of always questioned within photography, because in many ways that's the role that the design plays, I think, with photo books, is that sometimes you can have an intervention by a designer who, out of extremely great intentions, creates a certain design format for the book, and it allows to create a great curiosity and a great reaction. It might even sensationalize the work to a certain degree, but it might not be a reflection of who the author is. And so you have a great book in front of you, but at the same time the book just crumbles because it is not the book of the author anymore. I mean, does it need to be the book of the author is maybe another question that I wanted to know from you guys, because of course, as photographers, we solely believe that it needs to be the book of the author, but then there are particular formats of bookmaking that don't need for it to be so. I see you both are grinning very, very widely. Is that?
Editorially, it's very interesting because, like you said earlier, when you say Salsaja and I are reliable copy, we are both the publishers, we are both the administrators, we are both the coordinators, we are both the editors, we are
Right.
both distributors, we are the ones dealing with the printer, we are the ones dealing with the designer, the author, going to the bookshop, so our role isn't one or the other.
Right.
So, for instance, Ravi, when we finished this book, he's
Mhm.
published two books before this. Both of them were in Kannada. And he said that, for them, I only sent them a draft. They copy pasted and printed it. There
Right.
was nothing else. And that's what a publisher would do. But we're also the editors. So then we have a tendency to get over involved.
Right. Right.
But the good thing is, I mean, every project we've done has taken at least 1 year
Right.
in terms of process to come to the final stage. So we've been really fortunate to work with only 2 or 3 projects a year because then we're really devoted to those projects.
Mhm.
And we've also been very lucky to have artists who are open to our editorial role. So ones that actually understand that we're also here to make this the best book it can be and not really, take over authorship in any form.
Right.
What has been amazing is that each artist we worked with has also been as involved in throughout all the stages, even if it
Right.
was unfamiliar to them, whether it's design or copy editing or translation or so. That way, it's a very kind of collaborative process. We're very strict about finally the book is a reliable copy book, but it's more an artist's book. It's more
Right.
a Ravi Kashi book than it is our book. So
Right.
it's important for us to make sure that his voice, his perspective is retained,
Right.
but also to enhance that as best as we can, to make it as much his voice as the book can convey in that sense.
Right. Right. No, I
And
mean that's actually
one more thing
very
I
interesting.
should say
Sorry.
is that editorially each book has been very different. Like this was more of an essay in 2 languages.
Mm-hmm.
Mario's book was more of an experimental text. Chinar's was a photo book. The cookbook is now a recipe book. So, I mean, none of us have editorial experience in that sense. So, each book we approach with fresh eyes and we're learning as we go. And
Right.
so, each time, now we're making the cookbook, we're referring 20 other cookbooks, really studying them to figure out all the nuances, and then kind of approaching our book. So we're also learning with each project in that sense. It's not like either of us has experience in publishing or that much experience in editing. I didn't. Sarsaja still had a little bit. So that way, it's quite a fun journey because we're all on the same boat. The author might have never made a book before. We've never made a book before. You know,
Right. And I think that's the kind of the fun behind it, like the experiment behind it is that. Because you know, another thing that I do feel ends up happening with completely artist led books is that they can also go into a very isolated bubble. You know, it's like, this is what I was thinking and this is what I was imagining, and I've now created this book. But it becomes difficult for the book to then travel outside the world of the photographer as well. You know, it kind of, I mean, because one is not exposed to, or one has not understood, or one is always maybe even just too attached to the work to then separate themselves from it and kind of look at how it's been put together to allow readership. Even, you know, for me to even pick up the book and feel like I can read through it is, you know, is where the publisher comes in. So it's nice to know that there are three people or more. I mean, in this particular cookbook case, you have over 50 people, so I guess it's a different dynamic altogether. But you know, to get into that process, and I think what I'm now intrigued by, and you know, we've spoken about this a little bit, Nihal, is how do you choose what book to do? Like, what's how do you know this is going to be our next book? Is it like, what's the thing we haven't done up until now and let's do it? Or, you know, how do you guys work around that?
I mean, you want to give it a shot? We
Um,
have Vasvi
this is
here.
a really difficult answer. Yeah. Honestly, we're a really, really small team.
Right.
I don't think we have a structure in place yet for this. Like, we are not really in a position to be able to have an open call and look through. You know, we're just not there yet. So when Nihal started and when I joined, he already had 3, 4 books that he had in mind, who he had spoken to artists about.
Right.
Um, Most often, it's us approaching the artist because we know that they are doing something really interesting, which we think a published format would be interesting for. Actually, one of the attendees we're hoping to do a book with next year, Vasvi.
Ah.
So, um, yeah, I think maybe it's about finding a project that we think can take this form, I would
Right.
say.
Yeah, but it's also about an engagement with the artist's practice over a long time.
Mm.
So it might not be that there was a specific project in
Project.
mind. Like with Ravi's, it was very clear. He had this kind of research on political flex banners in Karnataka,
Mhm.
and he was doing it as a lecture series. I mean, he was doing it as a lecture. He did it twice, where he presented his research. And we couldn't attend the lecture. I wasn't here, neither was Sajja, but oh, you attended. Okay, I never did. But we asked him if he would be interested in making a book out of it. And in his mind, he was going to write a very short article in Kannada and leave it be as part of an anthology of writing. But then it kind of became its own book where we dug through 10 years of his photographs. We worked on the essay over some 13 drafts. Then it was translated to Kannada. Then that was copy edited. Then it was all brought together by Roshan, who's designed the book. Roshan, actually, we should mention, has been the fourth person in all of our projects because he's the designer, but he also kind of steps in as copy editor. He reads about each book. He'll invariably change something about each book.
Okay.
Designer.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, he's the secret person in Reliable Copy.
Right.
Anyway, so Ravi's book was very clear, but Chinar's book and Mario's book was more, we know them and we know their practice, and we are interested in seeing how it can result in a publication and what that would be. So even with Mario, before we started working on the book, we talked for 8 months, 10 months, just over Skype because he's based in Colombia,
Right.
about a book, about what is a book, what could this book together be. And it wasn't a book until the very end. At many points, it was going to be an online project, a website. It was going to be a series of posters. It was going to be a lot of things before it became a book.
A book. Okay. I think one thing that really did that I was a bit surprised by, and this bit I think happened more when, you know, we were talking about the offset bookshop aspect, was that I actually realized that you're able to produce these books at at costs that are much lower than what one would anticipate. You know, and I think that that's been very critical because a lot of art-based books, whether they're artist books in themselves or academia around it, um, the costings become very prohibitive for students or people outside of the art space or outside of a particular, financial bracket to have access to, uh, and I was curious to know that, was that something that was was it a conscious decision, and then did that lead to particular practices even in the act of how you publish?
I
Yeah.
mean, this is a common misconception about artist books, right? Because they follow the logic of the artwork.
Yeah.
So we will make an edition of 20 instead of making an edition closer to a published size, right?
Right.
If you make 20, of course, it's going to cost much more to make 20 as opposed to a
Right.
thousand. So then it repeats the logic of the artwork. So then, even though it's in a book form, it falls short because it doesn't get
Right.
distributed, it doesn't circulate. So for us, an artist book isn't a, like, this prestigious kind of carefully,
Sacred books.
but it's a book or it's a publication. Chanar's was free, Ravi's costed 650 rupees, Mario's is 700. The cookbook will also be somewhere there. We're interested in also working with the logics of publishing, right? Like for a printer to do offset makes sense if we do over 500 copies.
Yeah.
So we put 1,000, then it's okay. It makes sense to them, it makes sense to us, it makes sense to the bookstore who wants a 30% or 40% cut.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, otherwise, if you make a digital print, each book is going to cost 3 times that amount. If
Absolutely.
you make 100 books or 50 books, it's going to cost 3 times that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also working with the different kind of logistics and logics involved with
Right.
all
And
this.
how did that then impact? I mean, so let's say it's something that you do keep in mind, saying that there is a particular, because you want to go into offset, because you want to manage the costing to be at a particular price range where people, people don't have to think as much about it, before they buy a copy of the book. How did that kind of lead? Did that lead into very specific publishing methods or practices that you then had to implement? Whether it's about the kind of printer you'd go to, or whether it's about the kind of paper you take, or did that have any impact or not?
Interesting. I don't know. I think
No,
maybe we have. No, no, go for it.
no, because I mean, just as closely as we work with the artist or the designer, we work with the printer. So before we've imagined the book, we go to the printer and say, what size can you handle? Can you do this paper? Will this work if you have this fancy idea? So like this one, Ravi's book has a kind of spot laminations with glossy.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see it, you can't, but
Just
and
a little shine that comes through.
yeah.
You can
So I
imagine.
mean, this one, the printer in Chennai was capable of doing that, so we did it. This
This
is
is screen printed and foiled.
Right.
So there are certain things like this where, like he said, offset. There are a few other techniques like this that already exist within mass production.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what I would say, right? That we were looking at it as an object that is, in that sense, mass produced.
Right.
So
Right.
functioning within that became important because circulation became important.
Right.
So making 20 books that is not mass producible actually hasn't been the direction that we've gone in. We might end up doing something that's an addition, but I don't know how that would work yet because it's not something we've looked at as a plan in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. I also from here now maybe want to go into publishing itself, like maybe into, what I did find interesting that, when we were talking about reliable copy, like right in the beginning of this chat, um, Nehal, you'd mentioned that for you, it is about the act of publishing itself. It is, and publishing then begins to have various formats, and more so today, I think, when one is also kind of trying to grapple with, do we go, in photography, there's like the analog and the digital, and now, of course, many other advancements have led into AI and whatnot. But for you, what does the act of publishing mean? Like and what are the experiments within it? That you see from even, either within reliable copy, but even outside of it, that that have its own impact or echo with how we are moving in maybe a post-pandemic world. Although I hate to say that, but keeping
so,
that in mind.
So I have a friend in China. Her name is Elaine, and she publishes something called Display Distribute. She works on a
Right.
publishing house called Display Distribute. So she talks about how, as publishers and artists and people, we have to abide by certain truths.
Right.
And this truth is forever changing, but we must abide by it to the best of our ability. So publishing is like that. Publishing is like, see, if I want to make a book, I want to make a book. But if I want to have an ebook, that doesn't make sense. I'd rather do a blog. So you have to
Right.
be true to the medium in that sense.
Right.
So each act can be an act of publishing as long as you understand what the form requires and you understand what works within that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not trying to take one category and move it to another. You're working with that category to make it as functional as it can be within that category.
Right. Right.
So now if we make a website, it's to make a website. It's not as a substitute for a book. We make a book, it's not a substitute for a website.
Right.
So publishing can be anything in that sense, but you have to be true to it in that sense.
And sorry.
Yeah. Mario's book might be the closest example for that. Because when we started talking about the project, we thought a website was the best form for it.
Okay.
And it became a video, and then it became posters, and eventually. So I think it's about what project it is and what it really requires,
Mm-hmm.
but within publishing as a practice.
Right. Could you, in fact, take us through Mario's book and the different publishing formats within that? I mean, it might give us a glimpse into the work that you guys have been doing and to understand your approach to publishing.
Huh.
I mean, so Mario's book is kind of made into segments. Show the back, the
Yeah.
index.
So this is the
So
index.
the index is on the back cover, and each section, it could be either image, or it could be text, or it could be image and text, or it could be illustration, and it's divided like that.
Okay.
It starts with this kind of image section where there's a man walking in a desert. That's screenshots of a video game called Journey. And it's a kind of pointless game where you keep walking and walking, but the wind blows you back. So you don't reach anywhere. You never reach the horizon. So that kind of sets the mood for the book. And it also changes orientation. Like Sarsaja flipped the book and then the rest
Yeah, I noticed that. It's
vertical.
unusual to find that. That's nice.
And
there are image sections.
yeah, then it kind of moves into a slideshow like section where the black pages are the slideshow and there's all of these pictures that come in.
Mm-hmm.
And there'll be a text preceding these pictures explaining those pictures or kind of referencing those pictures. And then it breaks again into a different section. So it's divided in that sense between material. So this is an illustration by Roshan where it's like a sequential illustration that shows the domestication of a piece of land. So this very jungle-like place becomes a table, becomes a cabinet, becomes completely domesticated. These are all threads that run throughout the book. And then it goes back into the slideshow section and then comes out again as a fold-out page.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Sorry, if I may interrupt just for a second. I just want to know, so the illustrations that came in were actually made by Roshan, who was the designer for the book, right?
Yes, Roshan's also an illustrator. So the first illustrations were by him and this one is by Sarsaja.
Okay.
So yeah, we really are a little bit of everything in every publication.
Right.
I think,
Yeah, now I can.
like a fold-out page with a bunch of illustrations inside it. So basically, we were illustrating ideas that Mario was talking about in the book. But I think it's interesting the word that you used where you said the image pages are like a slideshow. That's almost how the book developed. Eventually, we asked him to record himself giving a presentation to me and Nihal. And then we transcribed that presentation and then shuffled it around.
Is that Mario couldn't. Mario, we've talked for 8 months about this book, right? And we figured out if it's going to be what it's about. And finally, he lands in India. He's come for 4 months.
Okay. And this is his first time here, or?
His first time in India.
Okay.
So I know him from Beirut. We spent a year together in Beirut at a study program. So I come and then I start a library copy and then all of that happens and then he comes to do a book with us. We have to do this together because then I leave for a residency for 2 months.
Right. Okay.
We talk about it. I introduce him to Sarsaja. He's never met Sarsaja before. I introduce him to my brother. He's comfortable, he's settled, and I'm off. And before I leave, he says, I'm going to make a book about this. I call him 1 week later from Germany and he says, actually, I'm going to make a book about something else. So then
Okay.
say, like you can't decide what book you want to make, and you have
Right.
3 months, and then how is this going to happen? So after all of those back and forths, we finally said, okay, if you can't decide what book you want, why don't you just present whatever your research interests have been to me and Salsija as a lecture or as a slideshow,
Just
and
talk to us about it.
yeah, and that developed into the main text for the book.
That's quite interesting. That's a interesting method to and an interesting approach to kind of arrive at the book that you want. It happens with us a lot. It happens very often in works that you're looking at that deal with maybe more street photography aesthetics or practice. Um, and that's why, to a large degree, I mean, sometimes I feel really sad because I feel like within the photo book world we don't see the street photographic practice as much today, because I think everything's become about what is your project, what is it that you have to say, so everything's kind of pre-decided. But so many times they're very, very maybe unnoticed observations and changes that happen in your practice or in your thought process, just because you're not focused or concentrated on preparing for a project, but you're just letting things kind of happen to you. And a lot of books that came within traditional photographic practice have that possibility where you look at a work in retrospect and then try and figure out who you became or what you were looking at for a particular time frame in your life, and that's how then the book emerges. It's almost autobiographical maybe in that sense. uh, but I don't think that happens as much now, and I think things get, for fair enough reasons, I think the conversations also in most of these books deal with something that requires a particular kind of introspection and process. But this is quite interesting where, like you have someone who is an author already of this book, but you have to find the book from him. You have to kind of literally get him to say everything he's thinking and feeling, and then cull the book out of literally his entire thought process. And
About editorial, I guess.
there you go. This is why your editorial experience is kind of assimilated into this. Um, I mean, going from Mario's, where you were first looking at this as something that could be a website and then a video, and also like going into your next project or book, let's say, which is the one Shanti wrote cookbook. Um, when you made Reliable Copy, let's just say, Nihal, were there any specific subjects that you knew you wanted to address? Did you, I mean, are there particular guidelines? I'm curious to know how I mean, I do know to a certain degree, but I think it'd be nice for people who are here to know how the One Shanti Road cookbook happened, because even though you call it the One Shanti Road cookbook, for me, like it's, you know, that becomes the maybe the starting point for what the book intends to be, in many ways. So if you could give us a sneak peek into what's going on there.
It was very simple. I mean, Sarsaja and I both have a long-standing relationship with Shanti Road. We've both been residents there in the past, and we've been friends with the people working there and Suresh. And so a lot of our social life happens there, in the sense that we all meet, all our artist friends meet there for lunch sometimes or dinner sometimes. And I mean, if you're in Bangalore, it's a very small scene also in that sense.
Right.
So, and of course, Suresh is also one of the trustees of Reliable Copy. So that's how, that's how much of a family we are in
Right.
that sense. So one day we were all there at dinner. I think Pushpamala was also there, and we were just eating something Suresh had cooked, or, as usual. And I think Pushpa was the one that said, if you make a recipe book out of this, it'll do really well. And
Right.
then Suresh got suddenly excited about this idea, and then one thing led to another, and we were there, so we became the publishers instantly.
Right. Right.
That was
Well,
the most
that's
genius kind of book that came into being.
right. And how do you then I mean, so that is that going to be a traditional publishing format, or are you looking at
It's going
post-pandemic formats as well? Let's
to be
just
a
say.
book. It's going to be a very functional recipe book in your hand.
Right.
Yeah, but we've been looking at formats like more familial cookbooks that have been passed down,
Mm-hmm.
and how those look and how the kind of things that they talk about. They give
Right,
you hints and tricks, and each person comes with something different.
right,
What is most fascinating about this book, I guess, because there are contributors of all age groups from around the world who we've had to retrace. Who some people came to Shanti Road like 15 years ago on some residency at some point, and we've asked them to contribute. So in that sense, it's almost like something being handed down,
right.
a collection of something that's being handed down, that's collected over 15 years of the history of the space. So I don't know. Yeah, it is quite a traditional cookbook in that sense. It's not really about
No
breaking
fancy
that format.
formats.
Yeah.
No fancy formats. But I mean, I'm curious to know within the virtual space, there are multiple experiments that are happening within publishing, and I mean, uh, is that something that you guys would be open to, or
We're definitely open to it, but like I said, it has to be, we have to be faithful to the medium.
right? I mean, also you have to find the right work that requires it to be in that format rather than push the format onto a work.
Like Chinar's work was made online for a very specific reason because it was a critique about demonetization.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to make sure that it's not for sale in any sense. So it exists online, so it can be free. If there's no material costs, then anyone can download it for free in that sense. And
Right,
it's also Creative Commons, so anyone can reuse the material, modify it,
right,
do anything with it, and recirculate it. Anything as long as it's not for a commercial use. So that was the only clause within that work.
I
right,
think we're also getting used to the digital format at the moment. I don't think this is really our forte. So we're
right,
to it slowly. So I mean, yeah,
right.
we can't even say with great surety whether this is something we will manage to do or not. I guess it's exciting, but we're not really
Right.
Peripherally, we're doing things like
yeah.
now Bangkok Art Book Fair is this year. It's going to be online, so
Yeah,
he asked us to also be part of it. So
nice.
Mario is making a video to kind of introduce his book, but the video will be also a work by him in that sense. He's making
Right.
a found footage film using the source material from the book, and they're publishing an interview between me and Aline, who I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier from
Yeah.
China, about reliable copy and display distribute. And
Right.
that's an interesting format because they're publishing PDFs every week starting September. And
Okay.
one is designed by a different designer and it's meant to be hosted online. And it's really built for the online space. There'll be
Right.
hyperlinks, there'll be all kinds of things going on within the PDFs.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I guess book fairs is one space, and I mean more international book fairs because in India we've not really had book fairs that have engaged much within experimental formats as much. I mean, there aren't many independent publishers also, from that point of view. Uh, but like we were talking about printed matter literally right before this talk, and they've also decided to go virtual. And at some point, it's great to know that suddenly, okay, there is an entire different bunch of people who otherwise didn't have access, and we would not have had access to maybe present our books there, now can be connected. But at some point there is also the joy of like tangibly stumbling upon a book, right? Like, I mean, I feel like that moment when you just find a tiny little thin spine, and you just pull it out and you're like, what is this? And if you just find something that you connect with, um, it creates a very different connection with the book form already. uh, I don't know if that's something that we're going to come back to, or if it's going to be as primary to how people begin to respond to the book. How kids who are growing up in a different way of engagement almost will look at the book. But it's I mean, it's something to think about, but it's also something to look at, because I mean, you guys have published 3 books up until now, and I'm curious to know from your point of view, what do you see as like the larger hiccups that do exist within the system, um, that make it difficult to sustain, or maybe maybe to publish more than one book a year, although that I think is a more process driven decision rather than, a financial one. But if one wanted to, like it's difficult to sustain a independent publishing practice. And I'm curious to know, like, for you, what do you see comes in the way of that?
Definitely a financially driven decision also. I think it's important to be able to address the financial aspect of it. I don't know. I think the hiccup that we've been discussing most over the past couple of years would be circulation, right?
And
Where
money.
it goes, and yeah, money, but like, of course, yeah, money is, that's what. Like,
Primary.
I mean, yeah, I get that it's process oriented and that's why it's like this. But
we're also doing everything because there's no money, like we're doing a good job.
yeah, because I was the next person. So in the beginning, it's great because we've learned everything. Because of the constraints, we've also learned every step of the process.
Right.
But this is not sustainable in that sense because,
Right.
this is crazy. Non-profit model. So that's another kind of very different way of handling finances, because within a year, everything gets spent back in the projects, and it's about spending the money back in the projects. So when we get funding, that's what it's about. And then often things like circulation or events around it or promotion always gets left out of the budget.
Right.
That's not what is being funded or accommodated for when someone is spending money. And also because we're such a young organization, very often finances that come in become subject to a kind of a service or something being provided back. So it's great for the first few years because we're learning through it and we're able to create such a wide network. Even for distribution, we started distributing books published by other independent publishers.
Right.
Books from Motto in Berlin, just to be able to understand distribution better. But sustainability is something that we're also, I think, trying to figure out.
Right.
That's a
But,
slow.
I mean, is there a way that can happen? Like, do you see a realistic way in which that might be possible? Let's just say.
We're hopeful. We don't have answers, but we're hopeful. Let's see.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think I just want to put out there, if anyone has any questions, maybe they can either address it in the chat section or the Q&A section, and we can pick them up from there. I'm also curious about what both of you are individually doing in your own practice right now. I mean, we've spoken about Reliable, to a fair bit, and I think it would be nice to know if there's any interesting project or the last work that you were engaged with. That would be really nice to share.
I'm on a break, so Salsija will answer.
What?
You are not on a break. You have just received. In fact, yeah. We'll start with Sarsaja, but I'm not letting you get out of this.
Yeah, this
That's
was
not happening.
clever answer to give.
Yeah. These breaks are not accepted.
Yeah.
Especially when we know things are going on. But Sarsaja, why don't you start?
Okay. So for starters, as a disclaimer, I work really, really slowly. And everything is most often a project. And my practice is extremely research based. So because I'm doing reliable copy or I'm doing other projects as well, like this, like either editorial or writing or something else, my practice becomes very concentrated around a certain amount of time that I've spent either in a studio or in a residency or towards a project I'm attempting to finish.
Right.
So the past 2.5 years, the project has been based on research that I did in 2017 and 18 when I was in a residency in Bombay, and then I went to a residency in Ireland.
Okay.
Has been the projects that I've been slowly wrapping up, and I kind of finished in the beginning of this year and did a show with it. But my practice is majorly about the organic world and myths and stories and kind of knowledge bases that are linked to it. I can't really go into great detail, so I can send a website and you guys can look at it.
For sure, you can write in the website on the chat. So
easier method. But I don't know, extremely process and research based, and what I've managed to do over the past over the past year is that I just wrapped up a project in Feb because I had a show in Baroda in March, a show that never opened
I was
because
just going to ask you, did that show open?
so it's become entirely online and it's still there for view in Baroda, but it's been an odd kind of transition because it was not meant to be online. I guess similar to how we're looking at publishing, right?
Right,
Making a physical show into something online is a very, very different ballgame. When it's ideated online, then that's a different issue.
right.
But the opening date of the show was exactly the date the lockdown started. So that's kind
Okay,
of
that's,
weird.
yeah, that's tragic. But I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting you said that, because I think one of the first things that I did think about is that if things begin to move online, what happens to installation based practice or performance based practice? Of course, there's ways to get performance on interactive formats in many ways. Maybe this is a performance going on right now, uh, but uh, but there's a creation of a particular energy when people are collected together, to view something and what that does. And I know there were a lot of virtual walkthroughs for exhibitions that did happen. I unfortunately got to see only one. And totally it was a completely separate experience from actually engaging with work, and decided after that to not kind of see some, till at least there's been kind of some changes maybe in the way the formats are created. um, is that something that impacts your work as well? Like, I'm assuming it does to a very
Yeah,
large degree.
I'm really not able to maneuver the virtual world. This is not something I'm managing. I think I'm just kind of waiting for it to settle in a certain manner. Um, I don't think an online exhibition is a space that I'm able to tackle. I've been approached by a few people, but I can't really understand how to handle that yet because I've never really worked like that before. I think right now, the past few months, at least, even for Reliable Copy, actually, it's been about research and planning towards an eventual physical implementation than trying to implement something online.
Right.
So, yeah.
Your turn, Nihal. We're not letting you go off so easy on this.
I
I'm
don't
happy
know.
to extend this chat for a little longer if that's what it takes,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been drawing more during this lockdown, but now suddenly I've kind of hit a roadblock, so I don't really know which way to go because a lot of the other things I was doing were kind of had to do with the city
Right.
because I was kind of studying these vinyl stickers on cars in Bangalore. So going to the markets and buying these stickers, then making collages out of them or archiving them. And so doing these things, but that kind of has stopped for the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And even the drawing things that I was doing have kind of wrapped themselves up. So now I'm kind of just floating and trying to anchor onto some project or the other, but it hasn't been happening.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where I am.
Right. And I mean, just to kind of I just want to know, you just received the experimenter grant as well for a work that you're doing. Is it in collaboration with Chinar?
Yeah, it's
Right.
Chennai.
And is that work that you are going to start? I mean, is that a new work that you're going to start, or is it something that? Uh,
The project is called Photocopied Blowout, and Chinar and I started it in 2016. And our idea was to kind of take this film, Blowout by Brian De Palma, which is a remake of Blow Up by Antonioni, and kind of break the film down into frames, print each frame out on a like a Xerox machine, and then scan it back. So what it's achieving is kind of like a filter, like if you put a filter on a photograph. So it's the photocopy filter, but to achieve this filter, we're actually going through the material process of reproducing each frame. And in that process, what happens is it kind of talks about the histories of the cinematic medium. It talks about piracy, the original and the copy. And since both Blow Up and Blow Out are about photography and cinema respectively, this becomes kind of a comment on both
right.
and within one work. So it's like a remake of Blowout, but kind of in a way where the remake doesn't change the story or the actors, but only the medium. So, I mean, again, it's a document in that sense. So it kind of brings it back to our discussion.
Right. I just wanted to read out something that Suvani has written on. It's in the Q&A section in case you guys want to read it as well. Uh, yeah, and it's not a question; it's more of a comment, as she says. But something that Nihal you mentioned in the bomb interview with Mario really stayed with me about how the process of making still life was also about resisting and rejecting until almost everything you tried to edit out somehow found its way back in. That is such an interesting thought. Again, makes one think about how the processes that go into making the book not only fold into the form and content, but also recast its initial intent. Just a thought, but would love to have you expand on the idea of resisting and rejecting if you'd like. She's added to that. Would you like to do so, Nihal?
I mean, I think I don't know what to say, Suvani, actually, because it's exactly that. I feel like even with because Suvani and Amar are also doing something with us, and I don't know. Can we put Suvani on the voice call?
Sure, sure. Suvani, I hope you're okay and ready with this, but let me see. Can I? You are, Suvani, you might need to rejoin us as she's
Hello.
currently a
Hi.
video participant.
Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Totally, Nihal.
Well, if you'd like, you can switch on your video too, and everyone can have you in a much, much brighter
Yay.
spotlight.
Hi.
Hi.
Not prepared at all. But yeah, I mean, I actually found that bomb interview of yours very interesting. And this thing that you said about leaving stuff out and how it kind of found its way back in. And even connecting it to the idea of the editorial choices that you guys are making, because editing is so much about what you're leaving out.
Right.
You know? So yeah, so I thought that perhaps if you'd like to speak more about the idea of rejection, not just in terms of when you're working on a project, but also like the stuff that you reject in terms of your initial maybe thoughts of a project itself.
So I mean, I can give you concrete examples because I can't speculate so much. But if I take Flexing Muscles and Still Life as two examples, Flexing Muscles as a book with Ravi was one where we tried to resist a lot of information that he wanted to have. Where, for instance, we felt a lot of the things about Karnataka and Bangalore as a city were really elaborate and weren't necessary to the reading of the flex panels. So we kept taking things out and he kept bringing it back in. So we would finish a draft and send it to him and he find the same thing back. And then,
Right.
you know, let's choose which of this is really the most essential. And then, you know, so it was a working through. So we kept resisting, he kept bringing it back until finally he gave in. With
Right.
Mario, we had to be the ones resist. I mean, yeah, with Mario, he also actually was the same process. He also kept bringing things in and we were resisting.
So Mario's was a lot more fluid because the entire concept of intent was being questioned itself. Like we were trying to figure out as we were doing the project what it was meant to be towards the end. In Ravi's, we knew that. So I guess the concept of resisting and rejecting was more focused. But in this, sometimes when something was edited out and it was brought back in, we were like, no, maybe it needs to be there, you know, because we kind of lost track of. So it was much more fluid process because Mario says this a lot, that it was not like artists and editors, it was just 3 people doing it together or 4 people doing it together with designer also as involved. So I guess, yeah.
And so then did everything find its way back in? Maybe not in the same format as you know initially, but
pretty much. I would say, yeah, in some format or the other, pretty much everything is made it back.
Right. And for that which hasn't, there is now going to be a video and another art piece that's been created. So you never know what might come in.
I mean, to look at it philosophically, it's the same thing about abiding by truths, no? Because then you're like, if this is, you'll find a way back in, you know, no matter, even if we keep rejecting, it'll come.
Yeah, if it needs to be there, then I guess. And I think that's what makes it actually this process of the I mean, rejecting and then bringing it back in is part of like that stage in the editorial process where you're also getting to understand where the author is coming from, where the artist is coming from, and why it means so much to them. And I think it kind of holds everything together in a much more rounded way, I guess, by the end of that.
I mean, often what you reject becomes the most essential thing in the book, finally.
Right.
There's,
Or understanding why you were rejecting it or why you're resisting it, altogether can often get you to, hey, this is what we really need to talk about. So yeah, I mean that's quite. Thank you, Savani. I'm very happy you were there for that bomb interview and we could bring that bit of it in.
All right.
So,
Bye bye.
joining in. And sorry for the spotlight, but I think it was fun. Why not?
now you're officially in the video with us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
No. I can, but I think we're also kind of running out on time. So I'm gonna wrap up the conversation here. But thank you so much for joining in, for all of y'all. And I think, oh wait, there might be one more
Nice
question.
question
Yes,
by Anonymous.
Miss or Mr. I mean, whoever it might be has an anonymous question, maybe. I'm curious to know about what publishing is to art philosophically, and if it is your kind of solution to the eternal artist's problem, like audience or a general sense of relationship with the world, with the rest of the world.
I mean, there's no one solution to this, no? So it's always about intent and degree. So, I mean, it solves one thing. It solves the idea of circulation, but then it doesn't maybe have the same impact as seeing a work of art on a wall in a space that's meant for art viewing, in that sense. And each work and each thing is going to kind of achieve something else, right? So it's really about what you wanted to achieve with art making or with one particular work, or I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, maybe it just also gives a second outlet or a second option
Right.
as to how an artistic work can be visualized, created, and circulated. It gives you another option, which I guess, I don't know if it solves a problem in that sense, but maybe it's just widening the base of options.
I mean, as an artist, you're never taught that publishing is a viable option for you, right? You're learning to
publishing a viable option is another question altogether, I think. Yeah.
But you're taught to make a video or a painting or a performance, and each one is trying to engage a different audience or a different media. But then publishing is never really considered. So I think publishing can be a practical answer to artworks as well. But it needs to be handled in its own way. It can't be handled like a painting.
And I think, I mean, if I may add a little bit to it, I think it's something that, when you're reading literature, you think of the book as the language, as the object of that language, But somehow when you're talking about art as a larger kind of space, you don't think about the book as an object with its own language. So, I mean, the same body of work could incorporate a book that actually can explore only so much, and maybe an installation or a performance or a painting or a sculpture that cannot be incorporated to the book, but is equal, I mean, needs to go together for the work to be what it is. So I don't think it's that one stop solution for anything. And I mean, it's maybe nice that it isn't that one stop solution, because it then pushes you to also think about why the book, and and every work cannot come into the book. That's where I begin to think of the catalog, Nihal. When you're just pushing a work to be in a book, but the book doesn't maybe contribute another layer for what you have to say. But on that note, I think we're going to wrap up today. This was really fun, and I'm actually kind of looking forward to the Shanti Road cookbook as well. Thank you guys for staying on and for joining us today. These talks are all, and the talks that we've had over the last couple of weeks, will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, but by next week, because we will sleep a little and drink a little bit of coffee and then get down to editing, you know. But thank you for joining us in today, and I look forward to what all is in store. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye bye.